spikes after your meals, even if your fasting glucose looks perfect, is quietly shaping how you age, how you feel by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, whether your skin holds up in your 40s, and how likely you are to end up on 3 or 4 medications by the age of 50. And as you know, I've worked in emergency medicine for 10 years, and the more I read into the research on metabolic health and insulin resistance and longevity, the more fascinated I become. This is an enormous subject, and I want to share all of that with you. So if you're new here, then hello, welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Alex, and my mission here is to help you prevent the diseases that I see all the time. And so if you find this video useful, if you get some value from it today, then please, please, please help me out, support what I'm doing here by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Only a small percentage of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. It would mean so much to me if you can do that. Now, what I want to do today in this video is walk you through 10 practical glucose hacks, ranked roughly by how effortless they are to implement them. None of them involve calorie counting, and most of them take less than 30 seconds of thought once you've understood the mechanism. Now, before we get into those 10 hacks, we need to sort of think about what we mean by a glucose spike. So when you eat carbohydrates, they get broken down into glucose in your gut, which is essentially a sugar, and that glucose enters your bloodstream. A spike is just a fast, sharp rise in the amount of sugar circulating in your blood after a meal. The bigger and sharper that rise, the more insulin that your pancreas has to pour out to deal with it. And this really matters because that post-meal peak, what we call postprandial glucose, is a stronger predictor of cardiovascular risk than your fasting glucose number in most people. And there's a really interesting piece of research called the DECODE study, looking at over 22,000 people across Europe. And it found that 2-hour post-meal glucose was more strongly linked to mortality than the fasting value that your doctor usually checks. So basically, every sharp rise drives a corresponding insulin surge, and over years, that pattern is what nudges you towards insulin resistance and fatty liver, and eventually type 2 diabetes, basically metabolic dysfunction that underpins all of the chronic diseases that we see in the Western world that kill us most frequently. So what we want is fewer spikes, smaller spikes, and faster recovery from the ones that we do have. So that's basically what we're trying to achieve here. So here are the 10 hacks for you. Now, hack number 1 is to walk for 5 or 10 minutes after you eat something, 10 minutes preferably. If I could just give you one hack out of this video, it would be this. Your skeletal muscle, the muscle that you can see, these are the biggest glucose disposal organs in the body. When you contract a muscle, it pulls glucose directly out of your bloodstream to use as fuel, because if a muscle is moving, it needs fuel to keep moving, otherwise it will just stop and fatigue. So it uses glucose in your blood to do this. Crucially, and this is the most important part, it can do this without needing any insulin at all. So you're effectively bypassing the whole insulin system and clearing sugar through pure mechanical work. And the reason this is important is that too much sugar and too much insulin in your blood vessels, over time, these are inflammatory. They cause tiny amounts of inflammation in your blood vessel walls, and it's that leads to plaque buildup, which can then rupture and form a blood clot and then cause a heart attack or a stroke. Now, a meta-analysis in sports medicine in 2022 looked at light walking after meals and found big reductions in post-meal glucose compared to sitting after meals, even with walks as short as 2 minutes. Now, 10 minutes is, well, really the bare minimum. If you can only manage 5, then that's better than nothing, obviously, but try and aim for 10 minutes if you can. The calf muscles in your lower leg are particularly effective at this, so even just pacing around your kitchen counts as well. The second hack in this video is to lead your meal with veg. So eating the components of a meal in a specific order changes the glucose curve dramatically. A very small but quite nice Japanese trial in patients with type 2 diabetes showed that consuming veg before carbohydrates reduced the post-meal glucose excursions by roughly 30 to 40% compared with eating carbs first, with the same total meal and calories. But what's actually happening in your gut to cause that? Well, two things are happening. First, the fiber from the vegetables forms a kind of sort of mesh or gel layer in your gut, in your intestine. So when the carbs arrive afterwards, the glucose stops them from seeping into your bloodstream as readily as they would have done before. The second thing is that the protein and the fat that follow the veg and the fiber, they trigger your gut hormones, particularly one called GLP-1, the same hormone that drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro are trying to copy, which further blunts your glucose spike. Really, the simplest form of this hack is to eat your salad or your roasted veg or your soup first before you touch the rice or pasta or bread. And what we do in our home is, as the evening meal is cooking, we chop up a whole celery or a couple of cucumbers or a few carrots, and then we just sort of snack on those as the meal is cooking with some hummus, and we get some really good fiber and protein and fat from the hummus into our guts before the meal has even started, which will mean that anything we eat afterwards will cause less of a glucose spike. And really, that is hack number 3, adding a veggie starter to your lunch or dinner. Really, this is the lazy man's version of hack 2. If you can't reorder a complex meal, just eat a small plate of veg before it, like some hummus and some cucumber or some carrots or a handful of cherry tomatoes or some spoonfuls of slaw if that's what you eat. Try and aim for around a third of the volume of what's coming next. It works through the same fiber preload mechanism, and it's much harder to forget than restructuring an entire plate, because there are some meals where you simply can't eat the veg and the fiber first, let's be honest. So just having a pre-starter full of veg is probably the next best thing. Okay, hack number 4 is to build a savory breakfast around protein. I bang on about this all the time. So the classic British or American breakfast is, metabolically speaking, an absolute disaster. We're talking about cereal or toast with jam or orange juice. God, why do we drink orange juice for breakfast? Or a pastry in the car on the way to work. This is basically concentrated glucose poured into your body that has been fasting for 10 or 14 hours. And this causes probably the biggest glucose spike and insulin spike of the entire day. You will spike really hard, you will crash a couple of hours later, and then you will crave more sugar by mid-morning or late afternoon or whenever. But why is the morning spike worse than a spike later in the day? Well, because cortisol, your stress hormone, is naturally at its peak first thing in the morning. When you wake up, your cortisol already raises your blood sugar to help you wake up. So if you layer a sugar-loaded breakfast on top of that, then you've created literally the worst case scenario for your pancreas before you've even left the house. A savory breakfast built around 25 to 35 grams of protein flips your entire day. So this is things like eggs or Greek yogurt with nuts and seeds, or smoked salmon, or even leftover meat or dinner from the night before, or things like tofu as well. Research from the University of Missouri has shown that high protein breakfasts reduce the mid-morning cravings and stabilize your sugars for hours and hours afterwards. Just remember that anything that tastes sweet for your breakfast is a dessert, and it's the worst thing that you can be eating. Okay, hack number 5 is to dress your carbohydrates. So carbohydrates eaten alone behave very differently from carbohydrates eaten alongside protein and fat and fiber. But what does that actually look like inside your body? Well, imagine sugar arriving into your bloodstream on a one-lane road, like a country lane. Just on its own, it floods in. If you add protein and fat and fiber to the same meal, then you've effectively put traffic lights and roundabouts on that road. So everything will slow down a bit. Gastric emptying will slow down. The carbs leave your stomach more gradually, and the glucose enters your bloodstream in a much gentler curve. So we're talking something like this rather than a big spike. So if you're going to eat pasta, then eat it with chicken and vegetables and really good extra virgin olive oil rather than just tomato sauce on its own. If you want chocolate, then have it with a handful of almonds, unless it's 75 or 70% or above. If you're having toast, then add eggs and avocado rather than jam. So this isn't about removing the carbohydrates, you're just surrounding it with some friends that slow its absorption. Okay, moving on to hack number 6. This is all about saving anything sweet for your dessert, and the timing really matters here. So the same biscuit eaten at 11 a.m. on an empty stomach produces a very different glucose response from the same biscuit eaten immediately after your lunch. As we've already talked about, an empty stomach allows sugar to hit the small intestine really fast with nothing to buffer it. But a full stomach slows down the whole process because the food already sitting there acts as a physical barrier and a digestive distraction. So if you want something sweet, then just have it as the final part of a meal rather than as a mid-morning or mid-afternoon snack. So you should get the same enjoyment, but you blunt the spike. You avoid triggering the same craving cascade that follows a crash. And what is that craving cascade? Well, it's when you spike really high and then you also crash really low about an hour later. And the brain interprets that as an emergency that needs more sugar. You feel jittery, you feel a bit sort of empty, and so you've got to eat something really sweet or high in carbs. That's why one biscuit at 11 a.m. turns into 3 biscuits by lunchtime. The next one is probably pretty obvious by now. When you snack on something, make it savory rather than sweet. Even if you think it's a healthy snack like a cereal bar, if it tastes sweet, then get rid of it. Snacking on sweet things between your meals is one of the most spike-inducing patterns in modern eating, partly because of the empty stomach effect and partly because it sort of pushes you into a cycle of glucose roller coasters across the entire day. So savoury snacks built around protein and fat, like a simple boiled egg or a piece of cheese or some Greek yogurt or some olives, or a handful of salted nuts, keeps you in a flatter glucose curve during the day and actually makes you feel fuller for longer than anything that's ultra processed. The 8th hack in this video is about sleeping like your glucose depends on it, becoming an expert sleeper. And this one clearly is very different to the dietary hacks earlier in the video. Now, a landmark study published in The Lancet, one of the biggest journals that we have, restricted healthy young men to 4 hours of sleep a night for 6 nights in a row. And their glucose tolerance dropped to the sort of levels that we see in pre-diabetic older adults, just 6 nights in healthy 20-somethings. But what does insulin sensitivity actually mean here? Because this is what we're talking about. Well, it's how well your cells respond when insulin tells them to take in glucose from your bloodstream. When you are insulin sensitive, which is a good thing, your cells listen and they clear the sugar away pretty quickly. But when you're insulin resistant, which is a bad thing, which is what poor sleep drives you towards, your cells stop listening and sugar lingers around in your bloodstream, and your pancreas simply has to shout louder and produce more and more insulin. And that state, sustained over years and decades, which is what we're talking about with these sorts of videos, it's about sort of building habits over the long run. That state really is the runway to type 2 diabetes. So if you're eating perfectly, but you're sleeping for 5 hours, you are fighting almost a losing battle. So you need to aim for 7 to 9 hours and protect your sleep environment and stop treating sleep like the variable that you can compromise on. Because when you're sleeping, that is when your body does the majority of its repair work. And if you're sleeping 5 hours a night, then there's a very good chance you're going to have some serious health problems later on. Our penultimate hack, hack number 9, is to lift something heavy at least twice a week. And again, it sits outside these typical glucose hack lists because most people don't think of it as a glucose intervention, but it absolutely is. As we've talked about before, skeletal muscle is the largest site of insulin-mediated glucose disposal in the body. But what does that mean in plain English? Well, think of your muscles as the body's main storage tank for carbohydrates. When you eat rice or pasta or white bread, the glucose gets stored as something called glycogen, and most of that glycogen lives inside your muscles. So the bigger the tank, the more muscle you have, the more storage room that you have, and the less sugar that needs to hang around in your bloodstream causing damage, because as we know, too much sugar in your blood over years can lead to heart attacks because they can cause plaques in your arteries. Resistance training also independently improves how sensitive you are to insulin up to 48 hours after a session. So you don't need to have a gym membership or live in a gym. You just need 2 short sessions a week focused on compound movements, again, which are squats or deadlifts or push-ups or lunges, anything that sort of involves a lot of big muscles together. These really will build that muscle that acts as your glucose buffer for the rest of your life if you maintain it. And this really is the single best metabolic insurance policy that you can take out. And unlike most things in medicine, the protection grows over time rather than fading. And then finally, our final hack on this list, hack number 10, that is recognizing that all sugar is sugar. So this isn't really a technique, it is a piece of clarity that will save you from a lot of marketing. So think of things like honey or maple syrup or coconut sugar or brown sugar or raw sugar or date syrup. All of these things metabolically, your body is treating these identically once they are broken down. They are all combinations of glucose and fructose, and they all produce glucose spikes proportionally to the dose. So this health halo around natural sweeteners is, with very minor exceptions, marketing rather than physiology. So this doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. It means you should choose them for taste, not for some imagined health advantage. And you should treat them with the same respect that you'd give white sugar. So if you love honey, then eat good honey. Just don't pretend it's a vegetable. And this doesn't mean you can't enjoy these sorts of food. It just means that you need to recognize that they are all sugar and they will all cause a glucose spike. But if you adopt some of these hacks in this video, then we can sort of minimize the damage that they cause. I would never say don't eat sweet things. I've got such a sweet tooth, but we need to recognize that anything in excess or anything that's eaten on an empty stomach or without any resistance training or without any cardio dotted throughout your day, they could cause some glucose spikes that over time, if you sort of generate these spikes long enough, could cause some real damage. But after all of that, where do you actually begin? Well, you don't need to implement all 10 of these today. That is how people fail with health changes and health interventions. They try to flip every variable at once and they get overwhelmed and they revert back to their baseline within a couple of weeks. So just pick one that feels the easiest for you.